Today's story is about a very rich man who decides to build a building, but to do so, he needs to demolish an old house belonging to an elderly woman. Without thinking twice, he orders the demolition, but when he approaches the rubble, the homeowner arrives and she kneels and cries remorsefully. Eduardo Lemos, a 55-year-old man, is known for his ambition and success in the business world. He built his empire from scratch and is now an uncompromising billionaire, always on the lookout for new opportunities to expand his business. With well-groomed gray hair and a serious expression, Eduardo is the type of person who does not accept no as an answer. His penetrating gaze and decisive manner intimidate many, but also inspire respect. One day, while reviewing some documents in his luxurious office, Eduardo received a call from his assistant, Marcos. "Mr. Lemos, we've found a very well-located plot of land in the city. It would be perfect for a new venture." Eduardo, always alert to opportunities, asked for more details. Marcos explained that the land was in a high-value area, ideal for the construction of a high-end building. Eduardo did not waste time and scheduled a visit to the site. When he arrived, he saw that the land was indeed promising, but there was an old house occupying part of it. For Eduardo, this was not an obstacle, but a challenge to be overcome. "We need this entire plot of land," he told Marcos. "Find out who lives in this house and start the legal proceedings for the purchase and demolition." Marcos, always efficient, soon returned with information about the house. "Mr. Lemos, the house belongs to an elderly lady who has lived there for many years. It seems she has no intention of selling." Eduardo frowned, but was not discouraged. "I don't care. Offer a generous amount, and if she refuses, we'll go to court. This land is crucial to our plans." Eduardo's determination was unshakable. He knew that to maintain his status as a successful billionaire, he needed to be always one step ahead. "We will build the most imposing building in the city here," he thought, already visualizing the future venture. His goal was clear: that land would be his, no matter the cost. During the following weeks, Eduardo closely followed the efforts of his team to acquire the land. Each obstacle encountered only seemed to increase his determination. "This house is just a detail," he would say to himself. He was convinced that everything would work out in the end, as it always had in his career. Eduardo spent hours in the office, planning every detail of the new building. "We need a modern design, something that really catches the eye," he instructed the architects. His vision was clear: a building that would become a landmark in the city, reflecting his success and power. The legal challenges with the old house were just a stone in the path. Despite his confidence, Eduardo was not an insensitive man. He knew that the elderly woman living in the house might be attached to the place, but for him, business always came first. "Everyone has a price," he thought. He was willing to pay well to get what he wanted. "Offer her an amount she can't refuse," he ordered Marcos. Meanwhile, the news about the possible demolition of the house began to spread through the city. Some supported the idea of the new venture, while others advocated for the preservation of the old house. Eduardo, however, was not influenced by the opinions of others. He was focused on his goal, and nothing would make him change his mind. Finally, after weeks of negotiations and legal battles, Eduardo received the news he was waiting for. "Mr. Lemos, we've got the demolition order," Marcos informed him. Eduardo felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. He knew the road was still long, but the first major obstacle had been overcome. "Excellent. Let's start the preparations immediately," he replied. Eduardo decided he would personally go to the site on the day of the demolition. For him, it was important to see the beginning of his new project up close. "This is just the beginning," he thought as he prepared to go to the plot. He was determined to transform that space into something grand, something that would reflect his vision and ambition. And nothing else mattered. The old house was a true charm, with its exposed brick walls and white-painted wooden windows. The well-kept garden was full of colorful flowers that perfumed the air. The porch, with a weathered rocking chair, gave the place a nostalgic and welcoming touch. It was a stark contrast to the modern and imposing buildings that Eduardo so admired. "This house has to go," said Eduardo, looking at the report his employees had prepared. He couldn't see the beauty or historical value of the place, only the obstacle it represented for his plans. "Marcos, start the legal procedures for the demolition. We can't waste any time." His assistant, always efficient, nodded and left to carry out the orders. Eduardo's lawyers sprung into action quickly, preparing all the necessary documentation for the legal battle. "Mr. Lemos, the situation can be complicated. The owner has rights and can contest the demolition," warned one of the lawyers. Eduardo, however, was not shaken. "Do whatever it takes. I want this land free as soon as possible." Meanwhile, the house continued to be a point of tranquility and memories for the elderly woman living there. But Eduardo never cared to find out who the owner was or what the story behind that house was. For him, it was just an obstacle to be removed. "We don't have time for sentimentality," he would tell himself. The first documents were sent to the court, officially initiating the legal dispute. "We're on the right track, Mr. Lemos," Marcos informed him during a meeting. Eduardo just nodded, already thinking about the next steps. "As soon as we resolve this, I want to start construction immediately." The weeks went by, and the legal battle only intensified. "The owner of the house is fighting tooth and nail," commented one of the lawyers. Eduardo, however, showed no empathy. "She's only delaying the inevitable. Keep pressing," he ordered. His focus was completely on the project of the new building. The local press began to cover the case, dividing the opinions of the residents. Some defended the preservation of the old house, while others supported the progress that the new building would bring. Eduardo, however, was not influenced by the public debates. "Our goal is clear. We won't stray," he said firmly. Marcos, on one of his visits to the site, was impressed by the owner's resistance. "Mr. Lemos, don't you think we should try to talk to her in person?" he cautiously suggested. Eduardo, however, was categorical. "We don't have time for that, Marcos. Keep going with the legal process. Every day we lose is money down the drain." At each new hearing, Eduardo became more impatient. "How much longer is this going to take?" he asked the lawyers. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Lemos. Justice has its own pace," they explained. But Eduardo didn't want to hear excuses. "Accelerate the process. We can't stay still." Finally, after many back and forths, Eduardo received the news he was waiting for. "We've got the demolition order, Mr. Lemos," Marcos announced with a mix of relief and enthusiasm. Eduardo smiled with satisfaction. "Excellent. I want the machinery to start working as soon as possible." For him, it was the confirmation that his plans were on the right track. On the day scheduled for the demolition, Eduardo decided to go to the site in person. "I want to see this with my own eyes," he told Marcos. Standing and observing the house that would soon be just a memory, Eduardo felt a mix of triumph and impatience. He was closer to his ultimate goal and nothing else mattered. Dona Jandira, at 82 years old, was a well-known and beloved figure in the neighborhood. Small and with her white hair always tied in a bun, she had a welcoming smile and a gaze full of wisdom. She had been living alone in that old house for more than 5 decades, since she married her late husband, Seu João. The house, with its exposed brick walls and white wooden windows, was a true home, full of stories and memories. "This house is everything to me," she would often say to her neighbors and friends. Dona Jandira was always a simple woman, but with a big heart. She spent her life helping others, whether with a kind word, a meal, or a wise piece of advice. "Life is lighter when you share what you have," was her philosophy. For many years, Dona Jandira worked as a seamstress, making dresses and mending clothes for the neighborhood. Her improvised atelier in the living room was the heart of the house, where she spent hours creating and chatting with her clients, who often became friends. "There's always a story behind each piece of clothing that passes through my hands," she would say, with a smile on her face. Dona Jandira's house was not just a physical place, but a refuge of love and memories. The walls were adorned with old photographs, depicting happy moments with Seu João and the children they had raised there. "Every corner of this house has a piece of my life," she reflected, looking affectionately at the time-yellowed photographs. Dona Jandira's children, now adults with their own families, would always come to visit her. "Mother, this house is a piece of our history," her eldest daughter, Anna, would say. For them, that place was a symbol of unity and affection. Even after Seu João's death, Dona Jandira kept the house immaculate, as a way to honor her husband's memory. Despite her advanced age, Dona Jandira was an active and determined woman. "I won't leave this house for anything," she said firmly. For her, the idea of selling or abandoning the place was unthinkable. "This is where I lived the best moments of my life. There's no amount of money that could pay for that," she affirmed with conviction. When Eduardo's lawyers started sending notifications about the demolition, Dona Jandira was devastated. "How can they want to destroy my home?" she asked herself, incredulous. But instead of being defeated, she decided to fight. "I will defend this house with all my strength," she promised herself. And she began to seek legal help to resist the pressure. The neighbors soon learned of the situation and mobilized to support Dona Jandira. "We can't let them do this to you, ma'am," they would say, offering help and comfort. For many, Dona Jandira's house was a symbol of resistance and history in the neighborhood. "This house is part of our community," they affirmed with fervor. Dona Jandira, despite the whole situation, remained calm and dignified. "I know God is with me," she would say, while praying at her small altar in the living room. Faith had always been a pillar in her life, and at that moment, it would be no different. "I will fight to the end, but if it's His will, I will accept it," she reflected, drawing strength from her spirituality. At each new court hearing, Dona Jandira prepared as if for a battle. "I won't give up," she repeated to herself. Eduardo's lawyers were determined, but Dona Jandira had something they couldn't understand, a deep emotional connection to her home. "They don't know what this house means," she thought, with tears in her eyes. Even in the face of so many adversities, Dona Jandira did not lose hope. "As long as I have the strength, I will fight," she told her children and friends. For her, that house was not just a place where she lived, but a symbol of love, history, and resistance. And despite all the difficulties, she was determined to protect her home. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Eduardo's lawyers presented solid and well-founded arguments. "This house is in an area that needs to be developed," said one of them, with a firm voice. On the other side, Dona Jandira, accompanied by her lawyer, listened attentively. "This house is all I have. It's my home," she whispered to herself, trying to stay calm. Marcos, Eduardo's assistant, observed everything with a serious expression. "We're doing what's necessary," he murmured to one of the lawyers. Eduardo, impatient, wanted quick results. We don't have time to waste. We need this land, he insisted, always pressing his team. Meanwhile, Dona Jandira felt the weight of the battle on her shoulders. Each hearing seemed more exhausting than the previous one. Mrs. Jandira, they are offering a significant amount for the purchase of the house, said her lawyer, trying to convince her to consider the proposal. I don't want money. I want my house, she replied, stubborn. Her emotional connection to the place was something that no one there seemed to understand. Dona Jandira's neighbors continued to support her, organizing peaceful demonstrations and collecting signatures for petitions. We can't let them destroy our heritage, said one of them during a protest. This house is important to all of us, added another. But Eduardo was not influenced. They are only delaying the inevitable, he stated coldly. With each new document presented, the situation became more complicated. Mrs. Jandira, they have many resources. This can drag on for a very long time, her lawyer warned. I know, but I can't give up, she responded, determined. But deep down, she felt the fatigue and discouragement begin to take over. Will I be able to do it? She thought, alone in her living room. Eduardo, on the other hand, was more determined than ever. Marcos, we need to intensify our efforts. We can't allow this woman to interfere with our plans, he ordered. Yes, Mr. Lemos. We're working on it, Marcos responded. The pressure to resolve the situation quickly was only increasing. Dona Jandira began to feel the emotional impact of the battle. I'm so tired, she confessed to a neighbor. But I can't give up now. The lack of sleep and constant stress started to affect her health. Mother, you need to take care of yourself, said her daughter, Anna, worried. I know, daughter, but this house is my life, she replied, holding back tears. With each new hearing, Dona Jandira's hope seemed to diminish a little more. We're losing ground, her lawyer said, concerned. They are powerful and have many resources. Dona Jandira simply nodded, feeling increasingly vulnerable. I just wish they understood what this house means to me, she thought, with a heavy heart. Meanwhile, Eduardo continued to plan the future enterprise. We're almost there, Marcos. We just need to overcome this last obstacle, he said, confident. Yes, sir. Mrs. Jandira is running out of options, Marcos confirmed. For Eduardo, it was all a matter of time and persistence. He couldn't see the emotional battle that was taking place. The news came as a hard blow. Eduardo won the legal battle. We've got the demolition order, Mr. Lemos, Marcos announced with a satisfied smile. Eduardo simply nodded, pleased. Excellent. Let's start the preparations immediately, he said, already thinking about the future enterprise that he could finally begin. The preparations for the demolition began quickly. Heavy machinery was brought in and parked in front of Dona Jandira's house. I can't believe this is happening, she murmured, watching the activity through the window. Her neighbors were equally shocked and tried to console her. We won't let them take you out of here like this, they said, but the reality was cruel. Mrs. Jandira, please leave the house. We need to start the work, said one of the workers, with a serious expression. Dona Jandira, with tears in her eyes, asked for some time. I just need a moment to say goodbye, she said, her voice breaking. The worker, moved, nodded. All right, ma'am. We'll give you some time, he responded, a little softer. Inside the house, Dona Jandira walked slowly through each room, touching the walls and remembering the moments lived there. Goodbye, my dear João, she whispered, looking at an old photo of her husband. Forgive me, my children. I tried everything, she thought, as silent tears streamed down her face. Each step was a painful farewell. Eduardo, outside, watched impatiently. Marcos, we need to speed this up. We're losing precious time, he said, irritated. Marcos, trying to remain calm, responded, Sir, Mrs. Jandira is saying goodbye. Let's give her a little more time. Eduardo huffed, but nodded his head in agreement. Make it quick, he murmured. The neighbors, seeing the scene, gathered on the street in front of the house. This is an injustice, shouted one of them. This house is history, added another. But despite the protests, the machines were ready to begin. Dona Jandira, leaving the house for the last time, was greeted with hugs and words of support. We're with you, Dona Jandira, they said, trying to provide some comfort. Dona Jandira looked at her house one last time, feeling an immense emptiness. I don't know how I'm going to move on, she told a close friend. You are strong, Jandira. You will find a new path, the friend replied, trying to be positive. But Jandira knew that a part of her would remain forever in that house, now marked for destruction. When the machines finally began to work, the sound of the walls being demolished echoed through the neighborhood. Eduardo watched from a distance, with a satisfied expression. Finally, we can start our project, he said to Marcos. Yes, sir. The area will be cleared soon, Marcos responded, already making new notes. For them, it was just another step in their business. Dona Jandira, sitting on a bench across the street, watched the demolition. My whole life, destroyed in minutes, she murmured, feeling desolate. A young neighbor approached and held her hand. We'll take care of you, Dona Jandira. You're not alone, she said, trying to console her. Jandira just nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. The rubble of the old house was quickly removed, leaving an empty lot where so many memories had been built. Eduardo, satisfied with the progress, began to plan the construction of the new building. We're going to do something grand here, he said, excited. Marcos agreed, already thinking about the next steps. For them, the future seemed promising. But for Dona Jandira, the future was uncertain. Without her home, she felt lost. What am I going to do now? She asked herself, without finding answers. Even with all the support from her neighbors, the pain of the loss was overwhelming. I'll have to find a new way to live, she decided, with a heavy heart. And so, while the preparations for the new building began, Dona Jandira tried, little by little, to rebuild her life. Eduardo arrived at the demolition site early, eager to see the start of the work. He stared at the heavy machinery lined up, ready to bring down Dona Jandira's old house. Finally, we'll make progress with our project, he said to Marcos, his assistant. As he watched the activity, he felt a mix of relief and excitement. Suddenly, Eduardo felt a gentle hand tap his back. He turned around and found Dona Jandira, her eyes full of tears and a deep expression of sadness. Congratulations on destroying my home, she said, with a firm voice, but full of bitterness. Eduardo was surprised to see the elderly woman in front of him. For a moment, Eduardo was at a loss for words. He looked more closely at Dona Jandira, and something on her face seemed familiar. Do I know you? He asked, confused. Dona Jandira, with a heavy sigh, replied, I took care of you when you were a little boy, after your parents died. You were just a lonely child. The revelation hit Eduardo like a weight. He vaguely remembered a kind woman who comforted him on the difficult nights after the death of his parents. Dona Jandira, he murmured, disbelieving. Yes, Eduardo. It's me. And now you're destroying the only home I've ever known, she said, her voice trembling. Eduardo felt a wave of guilt and remorse. I didn't know. If I had known, I would have thought twice, he said, trying to justify his actions. Dona Jandira just shook her head. Sometimes, what we need the most is not money or progress, but a little compassion and memory, she said, looking at the rubble of her home. Eduardo stood there in silence, watching Dona Jandira slowly walk away. The machine started working, but the sound of the falling bricks seemed distant. He felt that something very important was being lost at that moment. Marcos, cancel everything, he ordered suddenly. Let's find another solution. And so, on that day, Eduardo began to understand the true value of the things that money cannot buy. Eduardo moved away from the demolition site and went to a nearby bench, trying to process everything he had just discovered. He sat down, closed his eyes, and began to remember his childhood. He remembered the time when he lost his parents and how Dona Jandira had cared for him as if he were her own son. She would give me warm soup on cold nights and tell me stories to help me sleep, he thought, feeling a tightness in his chest. The flashbacks continued to flood his mind. I remember the smell of fresh bread in her kitchen, he murmured to himself. And how she would hug me when I cried for missing my parents. The memories came with clarity now, each detail more vivid than the last. Eduardo realized how important Dona Jandira had been in his life, someone he had unjustly forgotten over the years. A profound sense of regret took hold of him. How could I do this to her? He asked himself, feeling ashamed. She gave me so much, and I treated her like an obstacle. Eduardo looked at the machines that were now stopped and felt an overwhelming guilt. I need to fix this, he decided, getting up with determination. Eduardo went to where Dona Jandira was sitting, observing the rubble of her home with a lost look. Dona Jandira, can we please talk? He asked, approaching her slowly. She looked at him, visibly tired and sad, but she nodded. Of course, Eduardo. What do you want to say? She asked, with little hope. Eduardo sat down next to her, taking a deep breath before starting. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all of this, he said, pointing to the destroyed house. I didn't know who you were to me, I didn't remember everything you did. Dona Jandira looked at him with a mix of sadness and understanding. Sometimes, life makes us forget what's really important, she said softly. You were like a mother to me when I needed it the most, continued Eduardo, his voice trembling. And I repaid you by destroying your home. I was blinded by money and progress. Dona Jandira sighed, shaking her head. Eduardo, everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is what we do after we regret them. Her words were a balm for Eduardo's soul. Eduardo held Dona Jandira's hand, looking into her eyes. Please forgive me. I didn't know what I was doing, he pleaded. Dona Jandira, with tears in her eyes, squeezed his hand back. I forgive you, Eduardo. But we need to find a solution for all this mess, she said, with a slight smile. Eduardo felt an immediate relief, as if an immense weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Let's rebuild your house, Dona Jandira. Just the way it was before, or even better, promised Eduardo, determined. I'll use all my resources for that. Dona Jandira smiled, touched. Thank you, Eduardo. Not just for the house, but for remembering the boy you were and the man you're becoming now, she said, caressing his face. The two stood up, looking at the now empty lot. Let's start over, Dona Jandira. Together, said Eduardo, with a new purpose. She nodded, feeling a new hope blossoming in her heart. And so, in that moment of reconciliation, the two began to plan a future where memories and new beginnings could coexist. Eduardo spent the night awake, thinking about how he could truly redeem himself. Lying in bed, an idea began to take shape in his mind. What if I turned the building I planned into something that really helps people, he thought. The next day, he was already decided. The new building would be a site of free housing for the needy. Early in the morning, Eduardo called Marcos for an urgent meeting. Marcos, we're changing everything. The building we were planning will be transformed into free housing for those in need, he announced. Marcos was surprised, but he saw the determination in Eduardo's eyes. This is a big change, Eduardo. But I'm with you, Marcos responded, already noting down the new plans. Eduardo and Marcos began working on the project immediately. We need architects who understand affordable housing, said Eduardo. And we'll need donations and partnerships. It's going to be a huge job, but it's worth it. Marcos agreed and started making the necessary calls. The idea was to transform the place into a welcoming and dignified space for those in greatest need. Dona Jandira, although still saddened by the loss of her home, was moved to hear Eduardo's new plan. You're doing the right thing, my son, she said, with a warm smile. This building will bring hope to so many people. Eduardo felt a warmth in his heart upon hearing her words. Thank you, Dona Jandira. I couldn't do this without your support, he responded. The following days were full of intense work. Eduardo assembled a team of architects and engineers committed to the cause. We're going to create functional and beautiful apartments, with common areas for community, he explained. Everyone was excited about the new project, and the energy in the air was contagious. It seemed like Eduardo's idea was taking on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Dona Jandira became actively involved in the project. I can help with the part of welcoming the families, she suggested. Eduardo loved the idea. You have so much experience in caring for people, Dona Jandira. It will be perfect, he agreed. Together, they began planning how to select the families who needed these new homes the most. Eduardo also sought support from local organizations and businesses. We need materials, labor, and financial donations, he explained in various meetings. Gradually, he managed to secure the necessary support. Eduardo, your idea is inspiring. We will contribute with everything we can, said one of the local businessmen. The project was gaining shape and strength. Over the months, the building began to take shape. Eduardo visited the site constantly, following each stage of the construction. It's looking incredible, he said to Marcos, as they observed the apartments that were almost ready. Yes, it will be a special place, Marcos agreed, feeling proud of the work they were doing. The transformation was visible and impressive. Dona Jandira continued to support unconditionally, offering advice and caring for the human aspects of the project. Let's have an inauguration ceremony when everything is ready, she suggested. The families deserve a warm welcome. Eduardo loved the idea. Yes, it will be a new beginning for everyone, he said, feeling renewed and full of purpose. The day of the inauguration finally arrived. Eduardo was nervous, but excited. He and Dona Jandira were ready to welcome the families who would be moving into the new building. Today is a special day, Dona Jandira, he said, adjusting his tie. Yes, my son. A day of hope and new beginnings, she responded, with a tender smile. The families began to arrive, and the emotion was palpable. Children ran around the courtyard, amazed by their new home. Look, Mom, our new room, shouted a little boy, pulling his mother by the hand. Eduardo watched the scene with a heart full of joy. This is why we're here, he said to Marcos, who was standing beside him. The inauguration ceremony was about to begin. Eduardo stepped up to the small improvised stage and took the microphone. Good morning, everyone. Today is a very special day for me and for all of us. This building is a symbol of redemption and a new beginning for many families, he began. Dona Jandira watched with pride, remembering the boy she had cared for so many years ago. I want to thank everyone who made this possible. To my team, the donors, and especially Dona Jandira, who taught me the true value of compassion, continued Eduardo, his voice trembling. Applause echoed through the courtyard, and Dona Jandira felt a tear roll down her cheek. You deserve all this recognition, Eduardo, she thought. After the speech, Dona Jandira was called to the stage. Thank you, Eduardo. It is an honor to be here. This project showed me that, even after losses, we can find new paths and help each other, she said, emotional. The families applauded warmly, recognizing the importance of her role in making this dream a reality. The celebration continued with music, food, and much joy. This is more than I could have imagined, said Eduardo to Dona Jandira as they walked through the courtyard, watching the family settling in. You made the difference, Eduardo. You turned your guilt into something wonderful, she replied, holding his hand. The children played in the gardens, and the adults explored their new homes. Look at this place, it's perfect, exclaimed an emotional mother as she showed the apartment to her children. Eduardo felt a warmth in his heart, knowing that his decision had changed lives. This is what truly matters, he thought. Marcos approached, smiling. You did an excellent job, Eduardo. I'm proud to be a part of this, he said, patting his friend on the back. I couldn't have done it without you, Marcos. Thank you for believing in this craziness, Eduardo replied, laughing. They observed the party, satisfied with the result. Dona Jandira looked around, absorbing the happiness that emanated from every corner. Eduardo, you brought hope to these people and, in a way, to me as well, she said, her eyes filled with tears. Eduardo hugged her. You taught me to be a better person, Dona Jandira. That's the true gift, he responded. As the sun set, illuminating the building with a golden light, Eduardo and Dona Jandira sat on a bench, observing the celebration. It's a new beginning for all of us, said Eduardo, with a satisfied sigh. Yes, my son. A new beginning full of possibilities, Dona Jandira agreed, squeezing his hand. The story of Eduardo and Dona Jandira ended with a beautiful gesture of regret and overcoming. They transformed a painful situation into something positive, showing that it is possible to redeem oneself and do good. And so, on that day, under the starry sky, they celebrated not only a new building, but a future full of hope and compassion. We hope this touching story has touched your heart as much as it has touched ours. It's amazing to see how the past can completely change our present and teach us valuable lessons about compassion and regret. We want to know what you think of this moving story. Leave your comment down below and share your thoughts with us. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, as it really helps us a lot. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our next heartwarming stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.